morning, everybody. Good morning. Many people in the room, I guess many people online also. It's a pleasure for me and an honor, to tell you the truth, to welcome you today on behalf of the Fondation Genève Place Financière, that's Geneva Financial Sector Foundation, and Swiss banking. Today we're going to talk about net zero initiatives and forward-looking methodologies, as you know it. Perhaps I should introduce myself. My name is Alexis Favre. I'm a TV journalist, and for a journalist, let me tell you that it means something to be here today, because to be perfectly honest, not so long ago when you mentioned to us journalists sustainable finance, net zero initiatives, we thought it was quite theoretical, to say the less, not to say suspicious, to say a bit more. To what extent was the financial world willing to play ball as far as climate is concerned? That was, and perhaps remains, a question, but we are here to answer it, or at least to try to answer it. And yet today, here we are, it's happening. 2022, a few years later, things are moving, banks are moving fast. We have roughly an hour, maybe a bit more, but not much more, to talk about this subject today and to see how it's moving and what's at stake maybe for you professionals. So here's the menu today, or for this morning, until 10:15, 10:30. First, I must tell you that this is a hybrid event, 21st century, so some of you are here. Thank you so much for coming. Some of you are online. Welcome to you if you are online. Next time, don't hesitate to come to Geneva. You see, it's a great place to be. Two keynote speakers today, followed by a large Q&A panel. Our first speaker will be Simone Detling. Simone is head of banking at the United Nations Environment Finance Initiative. As you know, in matters of net zero, the industry leads and the UN convenes. So she'll probably tell us exactly how she convenes or how she's convening. Simone Detling will be followed by Lucie Pinson, head and founder of Reclaim Finance. She's not here today. She will be with us live from London. Reclaim Finance is an NGO whose motto could be finance dedicated to climate. So she'll bring probably some kind of a critical and fact-based insight into the matter. After each two keynotes, you'll probably have questions. I hope you'll have questions. So we'll keep those questions just a little bit for the Q&A panel at the end of the hour. That will come right after the two keynote speeches. And to ask the question, 21st century again, it's easy as easy can be. You just scan the QR code, that QR code, you also have it online. You will be directed to a page. On this page, they will ask you a code. The code is right here, small z 2WR88. So you can do it from now on. Just log in, and ask the questions, and we'll take all the questions, if not all the questions, a vast majority of them, in roughly half an hour. After the questions, the morning will be concluded by Yves Mirabeau, president of Fondation Genève Place Financière. So during that Q&A, both Simone Detling and Lucie Pinson will take your questions, along with Antonios Koumbarakis. He's head of sustainability and strategic regulatory at PwC. It's always good to have a big five in the room. They will also be joined by one of our hosts today, CEO of the Swiss Bankers Association, former ICRC, like all good men, I guess, former chief of staff at the Department of Justice. Sounds chief of staff at the Department of Justice, that's something. Former state secretary for international finance, to whom I give the floor, Mr. Jörg Gasser. Microphone issue.
Shall I start all over again? So thank you very much for the jingle and for the kind introduction. Dear President of the Geneva Financial Foundation, dear colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, it's really a pleasure for me and an honor to address you all this morning on this event, organized jointly by the Swiss Bankers Association and by the Geneva Financial Center. I try to be short and concise because I think it's very important to first of all focus on the keynotes and then secondly focus on the questions on the Q&A. Let me make some remarks on the current situation as we perceive it. There is by now a large consensus on the climate situation and the objective of carbon neutral society. But the coordination and tools to respond, incredibly enough, are still debated and even challenged. On top of that, currently we are faced with two constraints: a downstream constraint dictated by the need to reduce our emissions to meet the Paris Climate Agreement, and an upstream constraint on energy supply dictated by the geopolitical situation and the consequences of the war in Ukraine. However, sustainability problems are systemic, and as such, they must be considered in a systemic way. At least in parts of the West, the systemic approach structured by the UN Sustainable Development Goals seems to be widely accepted, but instead of action, very often we think it is sufficient to talk and to convince ourselves that we're doing a lot. In its 2030 Sustainable Development Strategy, the Swiss Federal Council clearly mentions the financial system as one of the 4 levers, together with education, research and innovation, economy and civil society. So it's not enough to keep on pronouncing lip services. We need concrete action, and we need to live up to the demands and the requests from our governments and from the international community. COP26 in Glasgow gave birth to the Financial Alliance G-Fence, which is, for us at least, the gold standard, and brings together efforts from different sectors of the financial system to accelerate the transition to net zero. Comparable and internationally accepted, it can be a response for the financial industry with science-based and intermediate targets and the obligations to disclose the progress made. The Swiss Bankers Association became earlier this year a supporting member of the Net Zero Banking Alliance and recommends its members to join international net zero alliances and sustainability initiatives in the banking sector. This year, here in Geneva, the Swiss financial industry puts its efforts together to showcase where we stand in terms of net zero commitments and increase transparency by publishing a study in August. The Asset Management Association, Swiss Sustainable Finance, the Swiss Insurance Associations and ourselves, we, with the support of PricewaterhouseCoopers, made a first assessment of the proportion of assets committed to the relevant G-Fence initiatives. Accordingly, 62% of the Swiss balance sheets are committed to the Net Zero Banking Alliance. 62% of the assets under management and 48% of the gross premiums are committed accordingly. So it might be okay to talk a lot, but we need transparency and proof that we are on the right track. We need to walk the talk, and this study shall help to follow up on this promise. The path ahead of us is still long, steep, arduous, and littered with stumbling blocks. We need to hurry. Time is running out, and therefore we need the commitment of all. G-Fence serves as a pathfinder that helps us to get out of our sleeping bags and head for the path up to the summit. Today, with our guests, we will try to answer some questions. What are the main leverages for the Swiss Financial Center on the net zero topic? What does it really mean, a climate-aligned financial flow? What can we expect from COP27? We will talk as well, but we hope to talk about action and what has been achieved so far. And in that sense, I wish you a very successful and interesting morning. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Jörg. Don't worry, no sleeping bag this morning. We'll walk the talk. Thank you so much for setting the scene. So to walk this talk and to tell us about how the UN convenes. I like this word. You will tell us about that. And while the industry leads, I'm pleased to introduce the person in charge of overseeing these initiatives, someone who was an early stepper of responsible banking, someone who also cycled all the way to Iran. And that's quite something also, Mrs. Simone Detling.
Good morning. Okay, fantastic. This works. Good morning, everyone. It is a pleasure to, for once, actually speak in the city I live in, Geneva. So thank you for coming to Geneva. Thank you for joining us online. And Alexei, you said it. It's finally happening. The dynamic that is there now around climate and net zero, but more broadly around the sustainability agenda for banks is really, I think, unseen so far. And what we see now is that banks, and I will talk mostly about banks because, you know, that's my job. Banks are really now more and more moving to the center of society's efforts for a sustainable, for a livable future. And one instrument, one approach that has really enabled that are impact targets. And I mean, today is all about the net zero targets, net zero by 2050. They are the most prominent example for impact targets. Even beyond this one impact target, though, it is a concept that is very powerful and that we will see not only for climate. So what I'd like to do today in this keynote is to take a small step back in the beginning and just look at what paradigm shifts have brought us to an era where banks are actually setting impact targets, where banks are at the center of and are moving in unison with society, with governments to achieve goals for a sustainable future. I want to look at why these impact targets are so powerful. And then, of course, we want to get into the details around, you know, these current very prominent targets around net zero by 2050, and what we expect from banks, what we encourage banks to do now. So the paradigm shifts that brought us here. When I joined, you know, the sustainable finance agenda, it wasn't that long ago, actually. We were just moving from corporate social responsibility to the notion of environmental and social risk. We just got to the agreement, oh yeah, this is actually relevant for our bottom line. And that's where we stood. And then came a big game changer, and you're all aware and will remember the Task Force for Climate-Related Financial Disclosures. Mark Carney, the tragedy on the horizon. All of a sudden, this moved to C-suite, to board levels, and what was really a game changer there was the move to the use of scenarios and forward-looking methodologies. We hadn't had that before. So now we have banks engaging with forward-looking scenarios around climate, around environmental risk. But at that stage, we were still in a mindset where it was about, okay, there's climate change, it has impacts on the economies, and hence risk for us banks, and so we need to manage those risks. That is our job. That changed now with the principles for responsible banking. That changed when a third, back then, by now it's over half of the global banking industry, came together to actually redefine its role in achieving a sustainable future in society. Because what the principles for responsible banking brought was a shift to impact. So now for banks, it's no longer, okay, things are happening in the world, environmental risk is there, we need to manage it. No, now it is, we are an integral part of society, and it is our role to, with what we finance, help achieve society's goal for a sustainable future. Now, banks are really taking on their role and their responsibility. They're at the center of the efforts, and they're moving in unison with governments, with real economy, and with civil society. And how do they do that? And this brings me now again to these impact targets. And they're quite powerful, and Jörg, you alluded to this. What they allow is, from my perspective, three things. First is systemic change. Now, governments, society, real economy, financial sector, they're working towards the same goal expressed in the same metrics and language. We're all working now towards 1.5 degrees. We're working towards net zero by 2050. So now all actors have the same goal, the same language, and can move in unison. And that's really what we need for systemic change, because we had a discussion earlier. The banking sector can do a lot, but it can't move by itself. If a country, if a government is heading in a 4 degrees direction, there is only so much a banking sector can do to steer towards 1.5, but it won't work. So it's really, these impact targets allow for systemic change and for key actors to move in unison. And related to that, and I think that's the second point why these targets are so powerful, is a common language. Normal people can now understand what banks are doing and what their role is in society. I can now understand, okay, my bank is contributing to, is moving towards, is financing in a way that brings us to a 1.5 degree future. People can understand what is the role of banks in society, the potential positive role. But also employees can understand how their day-to-day work in the bank actually relates to their broader life, to the future that they want for their children. And the third aspect that makes these targets so powerful is the ability now to really integrate sustainability into the strategy of a bank. All bankers we talk to always tell us, look, until you have targets, you do not get the attention of boards and senior leadership. So impact targets are really what elevates these topics to the board level, to the C-suite level, and what then enables a bank to strategically align, to track progress, to really make this a part of the normal way of how they do business. So that's why these targets, from our perspective, are so powerful, and the paradigm shift behind it, really for banks to see themselves at the center of society's efforts. And the most prominent example we have these days are the net zero by 2050 targets. And it's fantastic how much dynamic there is. And by now we have about 120 banks aligned behind these net zero targets in the Net Zero Banking Alliance. And why is it important that banks come together to actually operationalize these targets, set these targets, achieve these targets? That brings us a little bit to the role of the UN. So the UN Environment Finance Initiative convenes a network of about 400 financial institutions representing about 100 trillion. And putting these net zero targets into practice for banks, it really requires a lot of technical knowledge and methodology, but it also requires a lot of harmonization, a lot of joint guidance, a lot of agreement for what scenarios to use, how to calculate certain metrics, and a lot of common challenges around data. So there is really a lot of power in doing this as a coalition. And of course, and this has been mentioned as well, the banks are not doing this alone. The financial sector is not doing it alone. This is then all part of the Glasgow Financial Alliance, and even broader, the Race to Zero. So there are alliances not just in the financial sector, but also of cities, of governments, of real economy. And these have to be coordinated across the board so that we do move, again, in unison in the same direction. That's how we effectively get to where we need to get. So, of course, we need all banks to set net zero targets. And what does this mean? What do you commit to when you join the Net Zero Banking Alliance? It means transitioning the greenhouse gas emissions from your lending and investment portfolios to align with scenarios that bring you to net zero by 2050. Within 18 months of joining, you have to set your 2030 and 2050 targets and targets for every 5 years in between. For the very first targets, it can be concentrated on the sectors where you really have the strongest impact on greenhouse gas emissions. And then by 3 years, it has to be all the sectors where there are significant greenhouse gas emissions. And of course, there needs to be transparency and accountability, annual publication of absolute and emissions and emission intensity, as well as progress against a board-approved strategy. Having said that, once again, taking a step back, net zero by 2050 in the climate agenda is one piece of the puzzle. We're moving towards now, in December, we call it a bit the Paris moment of the nature agenda. There will be the COP on biodiversity in Montreal, and we will not achieve climate goals without, at the same time, also making sure that we achieve our goals around nature, around ecosystems, that we keep the world's ecosystems alive and working. And so what the principles for responsible banking do is really give your bank a very strategic outlook, give you an understanding of the different pieces of the puzzle, how they fit for your strategy and how they fit for your portfolio. So really, come join the Principles for Responsible Banking to strategically align your business to really understand, measure, publish your impacts on all relevant environmental and social sustainability issues, and then based on that, set your targets to align with our agendas for a sustainable, for a livable future. And as part of this, then set your 2050, net zero by 2050 targets. So that's what we offer, what we encourage you to join. And I very much look forward to a hopefully hot debate around the net zero by 2050 targets, because I will say that always shows us that we're doing something relevant when there's a lot of reaction and argument going on, and that we're really pushing the boundaries. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Oops, Simone, please stay with us just for, I'm going to ask you two questions. I have this privilege. You don't have this privilege yet, but you will have it in a few minutes. Again, can we have the QR code maybe? Scan the QR code, put in a little code, and then you can ask all the questions. We'll take them in 15 minutes. Just two questions for you now on what you just said, Simone. How do you tango? How does the UN tango with the banks that knock at the door of the alliance? How do you take into account their experience, what they're facing? How do you accompany? How do you help them? How does this UN banking world tango works?
How do we tango? Look, I think what we do at the UN, I mean, together with financial institutions, is we develop and we provide frameworks. And we agree on certain standards and standardized ways of doing things. We've done this with the Principles for Responsible Banking. We are doing it with the Net Zero Banking Alliance. It's partly a bit of a moving target because of, as we mentioned earlier, there are a lot of actors involved, right? It is not just banking, it is not just the financial actor, it is all the initiatives, not only under GFANZ, under Net Zero. So there is a lot of tangoing all around to bring everybody together and in the same direction. So we tango by pushing, of course, for maximum ambition, and the UN has its goals and standards, and of course, they're not negotiable. I would say, though, that really most of what we do is convene, bring together, and support, because the banks that come and the banks that really engage, they do want to get there. It is really a matter of working together constructively, of facilitating a lot of peer learning and exchange and discussions for how to get there. Now, of course, you know, there are always cases where maybe that doesn't work in the end, or where for some reason the bank does not want or cannot live up to its commitment. And also for that, of course, we always need to build in processes, which both the Principles for Responsible Banking and the Net Zero Banking Alliance have. There is the ability to, over time, let banks go that really are not credibly working towards the commitments made.
Now that you mentioned banks that hesitate, big US banks, JP Morgan, Morgan Stanley, BOA, they all threaten to leave the alliance because they're afraid that their decarbonation strategy might lead them into legal trouble. So what do you say to that?
I think, as I mentioned a bit at the end of the speech, generally a bit of, let's say, arguing and conflict and difficulties is good, because we know and we see that we're really pushing the boundaries of ambition. At the same time, you know, these banks are incredibly important for achieving global climate targets, and we all have to make sure that what we put forward is doable. So, you know, I think for the moment there are discussions, and we are very much hoping and expecting that we will go forward with the Net Zero Banking Alliance being part of GFANZ under Race to Zero criteria and having these banks on board. But yeah, at the moment there is a lot of discussions between all the different bodies, and we have to come to a solution.
So let's hope threats will remain threats. Thank you. Let's hope threats will remain threats. Thank you so much, Simone Detling. Don't go too far, because we'll need you in about 15 minutes. Thank you very much. You can give her a round of applause. So to move on to our next keynote speaker, she's the head of Reclaim Finance, as I told you before, an NGO she founded 2 years ago after a almost lifelong dedication to environmental issues. She chose, and that's her decision, to bet on the ability of finance to change for good. And she's in London right now. I hope she's in London. Yes, she's in London. So, Lucie Pinson, welcome. I give you the floor. It's all yours.
Thank you. Thank you a lot for your invitation. And yes, I am in London, but I wish I would have been with you today. This is the third finance or climate event that I attend, remotely or not, this year in Switzerland. And I don't know what the reactions to my presentation will be today, but last time I went to such event, I was asked whether Reclaim Finance was going to settle down in Switzerland to challenge the Swiss financial sector. And I think this tells a lot about the need for transparency, for accountability, and to push the Swiss financial sector to meet its responsibility to act in a context of a climate emergency. I am very encouraged that the Swiss Banker Association and the Asset Management Association Switzerland have committed to addressing climate change through the support of the GFANZ Alliance. In doing so, they are sending a message to the members that they need to take immediate actions to decarbonize their activities with targets by 2030, which are 1.5 aligned and which follows the IPCC low or no temperature overshoot scenarios. In other words, to give hope that Swiss glaciers might survive beyond the next few decades, and that the climate disasters that have just befallen Pakistan and Cuba and Puerto Rico and Florida, and what is happening to the Horn of Africa and what happened in Europe this summer, do not become just the ongoing daily horrendous reality for a large part of the world population. We know that UBS and Credit Suisse were founding members of the NZBA, and that the Swiss Banker Association has become one of its supporting members. As it was said, that altogether 62% of the total assets of the SBA members are committed to the NZBA. This commitment to defense is especially important now that we hear rumblings from the US and Canadian members of the NZBA, including in the pages of the Financial Times, that they might just walk away from the alliance now that they realize that they are actually expected to change the way they do business. However, as my organization said in the title of a report on defense for the Glasgow COP, it's not what you say, it's what you do. Commitments to net zero, we do zero to help mitigate climate change unless these commitments are followed up by rapid, sustained, and meaningful actions. It's clear what we need to do. We need to reduce CO2 emissions by 50% globally between 2020 and 2030, according to the IPCC. And it's clear that the main way we will do this is by slashing production and use of fossil fuels, which were responsible for 86% of total CO2 emissions over the past decade. The IPCC and the IEA have given us roadmaps for how to do this, and both agree that there is no room in 1.5 carbon budgets for any new fossil fuel infrastructure. The UN Race to Zero campaign has also made clear that its members must end the financing for new unabated fossil fuel projects, which, because of the lack of viable method of abating fossil fuels, is in effect the same as saying end support to all new fossil fuel projects. All members of defense and its member alliance must comply with the criteria of the Race to Zero, which is basically the only requirement of joining defense. So all the 27 Swiss banks in the NZBA are going to have to adopt policies which phase out their support not just for coal, but also for oil and gas expansion. Fortunately, some French and German investors, but also Swiss Re, are starting to adopt these policies. And while not perfect, these emerging policies do provide a model for Swiss banks to follow. Another requirement of the Race to Zero is that its members adopt by June 23 transition plan with clear targets and actions to be taken over the next year, by 2025 and by 2030. These transition plans should be the vehicles where financial institutions explain the processes they will adopt to meet their target of halving their emissions by 2030 and to phase out support from the fossil fuel sector. These transition plans should be seen as an opportunity where financial institutions can make clear once and for all the commitment to withdraw their support for fossil fuel expander, because there is work to do. Indeed, Reclaim Finance analysis shows that Swiss banks are far behind their leading European peers when it comes to their policies on fossil fuels and fossil fuel expansion in particular. On our coal policy tracker, Credit Suisse scores only 3 out of a possible 10 points for the robustness of its policy on coal developers. UBS is even worse, with a score of only 2 points. 12 NZBA members scores higher than this, with La Banque Postale, BNP Paribas, Crédit Mutuel, UniCredit, Lloyds, Natixis, Nordea, and Société Générale all scoring at least 8 points. Today, both big Swiss banks keep supporting coal developers such as Glencore, which is not only one of the top coal producers worldwide, one which is said to be associated with human rights violation, but is incredibly still opening new coal mines. In our oil and gas policy tracker, both the globally significant Swiss banks score a 0 on an expansion metric. Yet, change could be on its way. Indeed, one area in which both major Swiss banks are notably ahead of many of their peers is on the sectoral lending targets for the finance emissions from fossil fuels. Credit Suisse targets is for a 49 reduction in fossil fuels finance greenhouse gas emissions between 2020 and 2030. UBS targets is for a 71 cut in greenhouse gas emissions associated to their loans to fossil fuels company over the same period. Notably, both banks' targets are based on absolute rather than intensity-based emissions matrix, and both include the Scope 3 emissions of their clients. UBS fossil lending targets is also the only one we have yet seen from a major net ZBA bank, which can be said to be consistent with the race to zero criterion for 2030 targets, which is say they represent a fair share of the 50% global reductions in CO2 emissions required to stay under 1.5. Indeed, under the UN Climate Convention's concept of fairness, developed countries must cut their emissions much quicker than developing countries. Will their targets be enough to prevent new fossil fuel assets which do not fit into the remaining carbon budget and whose development could lock in massive greenhouse gas emissions for decades? Maybe not. The 2022 Banking on Climate Chaos reports, which Reclaim Finance helped to produce, shows that UBS fossil fuel finance increased by 60% between 2020 and 2021. Credit Suisse claims that the preliminary numbers show them succeeding in cutting their lending emissions by 41% just between 2020 and 2021, mainly because of reduced exposure to coal companies. This is an impressive number, although a very different picture is given in the Banking on Climate Chaos report, which shows that Credit Suisse fossil fuels finance volumes as basically flat in nominal terms over this period. In fact, Credit Suisse finance, specifically for the 100 largest fossil fuel expansion companies, increased by around 10% between 2020 and 2021. Our overall message for UBS and Credit Suisse is that while they have taken some important steps towards the need our overall message for UBS and Credit Suisse is that while they have taken some important steps forward, they need to do much better and much more to meet their overall commitment to the defense target of aligning with 1.5 degrees. Of vital importance is that they will need to include underwriting in their targets. According to our data, finance from underwriting is slightly larger than finance from lending for the world's 60 largest banks overall. So underwriting might be part of the reason for the inconsistency between our data and Credit Suisse claimed 41% cut in finance emission in 2021. Fortunately, PCAF is working on a methodology for calculating what they call facilitated emissions from underwriting activities. And when this is published, Swiss banks should incorporate facilitated emissions into their 2030 targets. Beyond integrating underwriting in their targets, UBS and Credit Suisse must use their leading role in the Net ZBA to insist that the Alliance annually review its guidelines, as it's the case with the Net Zero Asset Owner Alliance, and strengthen its requirement. This work can be done along with the Swiss Banking Association and other Swiss financial institutions that have pledged to net zero. The three priorities for this advocacy are that fossil fuel targets are based on absolute metrics and Scope 3 emissions, and that underwriting targets are included in the next version of their guidelines. To conclude, we are encouraged that the Swiss banking sector's commitment to doing its part in the challenge of keeping warming below 1.5 degrees, and by the initial fossil fuel lending decarbonization targets set by the two biggest Swiss banks. But the devil is in the detail when it comes to ensuring that commitments actually result in the emissions reduction we need. In particular, we need stronger policies from the Swiss banks and the Net ZBA that brings the huge capital flows facilitated by underwriting activities into climate targets and support for fossil fuel expansion and allocate the capital where it's needed to the implementation of real climate solutions. Momentum is building, with now 21 global institutions having policing to end financial services for all coal developers, and 13 financial institutions restricting finance to oil and gas expanders. It's time for Swiss banks to get on this train. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Lucie. I guess your message has been heard. Again, 2 questions for you from me before you ask your questions. We understood that net zero initiatives and objectives and forward-looking methodologies go together. There's no objective, there's no reaching of an objective without these methodologies. What do you reckon the strongest or the most efficient leverage is for the financial and banking sector in particular in order to reach net zero objectives?
Methodology is a big important thing, and we need to carry on working on methodology to tackle the overall emissions in a portfolio. But data is already available to at least prevent banks to worsen the climate situation right now. As I said, the IEA and IPCC have made very clear that there is no room for new fossil fuel assets, especially in the production sector. And the good news is that we do have the names of these companies. We do have data that show how many gigatons of new coal, oil, or gas some companies are planning to expand in the coming years. These data might be found in URGEVAL Global Coal Exit List or Oil and Gas Exit List. And it's time for the Swiss financial institutions to grab this data and implement policies that will cut new financial services to companies that will not give up on their fossil fuel expansion plan. It won't bring us to 1.5 because 1.5 requires also to decommission, close in a just way the existing assets, but at least it will prevent the banks from the Swiss financial sectors to today be part of the climate problem and not of the solution.
Another question, you probably noticed, as we all are, that there's an energy crisis going on. And during this energy crisis, we see gas plants being relabeled as sustainable by the European Union. To what extent is that changing the game?
Sure. We would have, especially European countries, would have met the renewable targets and would have cut our reliance on fossil fuels much earlier by cutting the use of energy overall. We wouldn't maybe not have been in such a disastrous situation. However, again, the development of new gas infrastructure in Europe will do nothing to solve the situation in the short term. New gas infrastructure, especially the LNG terminals that are in the pipeline right now, won't come to light before 5 years from now on. So other IEA, again, has stated in the aftermath of the Putin's war in Ukraine, the solution is to speed up the transition out of fossil fuels and not to slow it down for very short-sighted projects.
Thank you very much, Lucie. Stay with us, please, because it's time to open the floor to questions, again, both on-site and online via our Slido system. I get already a few questions here. Please, Simon Detling, Jörg Gasser, will you please join me on stage here on these red chairs? And you will be joined by Antonios Koumbarakis, Head of Sustainability, as I said, and Strategic Regulatory at PricewaterhouseCoopers. You be welcome on the stage, Antonios. Please join me. So I guess you understood how it works. I'm going to start with a question. Actually, the first one that will give me the time to read the other ones. Just time for you to take place, Antonios. Thank you very much for being here with us. So I guess the questions are not, for particular institutions that these people represent, but on the matter in general. I got an anonymous question. We love anonymous questions. They're actually all anonymous almost. I just read it as I discover it, and then we'll decide who answers it. So there are a number of different initiatives emerging. Small regional banks may not have the capacity to align with all. What is your advice for such players? That will be for the convening UN person. Simon.
Is this already on? Oh, great.
No, it works.
Fantastic.
Should work.
Join the principles.
What's your advice?
No,
Join.
I mean, join the principles for responsible banking as an overarching framework. And I think it's also quite important to say there that it's not on top. If a bank is not aligned with where we're heading, if a bank is financing currently in misalignment with where we're heading, that's not going to be a successful bank. So it is really there to help a bank understand how its financing relates to climate, to nature, to social issues, especially also in its own context, and how it needs to position itself, how it needs to strategically maybe change some of its business to succeed well in the future. And then these things are not additive. they all form part of each other. So, the net zero in a way is how banks then get together to address how they align in the specific area of climate change. Start with the overarching framework, understand strategically which areas are most important for you, and climate change will probably be one of them, and then benefit from what is there. And I will say, of course, for the banks that are first movers, that requires a lot of resources, because you kind of have to make the path by walking it together with others. But for the banks that come already just a little bit later, the work is done, the methodologies are there, the examples are there, and so, benefit from it.
And we can actually say that small regional banks are already member of the NZBA, right? Jörn Gasser.
Yeah. Absolutely, and once the methodologies are established, examples set, the small and regional banks must come to the conclusion that basically the whole economy must be sustainable in the future. So from that point of view, these banks have clients. These are maybe small and medium-sized enterprises. They need to be sustainable as well, and they can accompany those companies along the path towards net zero. So from that point of view, I wouldn't worry too much. It's just, it's an obligation that we have to follow up for all of us, and the small and medium banks can be a service provider on the path towards net zero.
And to say a little secret, out of the 4 institutions, it's banks in Switzerland that are member, 2 of them are small regional banks already, so it is possible probably. Antonis, welcome on stage. It's tough for you because you still didn't have a chance to test your microphone.
Thank you.
I'll give you one. Love your socks, by the way. The Big 4 seem to be holding, it's an anonymous question again. The Big 4 seem to be, it disappeared. No, now. The Big 4 seem to be holding back transition ambition by advising clients, I lost that's technology, by advising clients to not announce stretch targets. How do you resolve these conflicting advice? Are you giving bad advices to the clients? Can't believe that.
Well, first of all, I would say we do not give bad advice, and as we heard also in the presentations before, it's first of all, what is important is to understand what is net zero. When we spoke about net zero, we spoke about the big 6, meaning also methane, for example. Mm-hmm. We see now what's happened with the pipeline disaster, for example. And it's at the end, it's to have methodologies in place, and there are methodologies, and also participating in these alliances for net zero for asset managers and banks plays an important role. And here you have, for example, science-based targets that provides for you clear methodologies, temperature rating approach, sectoral decarbonization approach, portfolio coverage approach. These are then linked with other initiatives as the climate score and so on. And for PwC, it's to help the clients to understand these strategic aspects, also what we heard from UNEP-FI, setting the right targets, and also disclose and be transparent. And some institutions, they are front runners, they're doing a lot, would disagree with some aspects that we heard before in the speech, but others are on the way, and we have also to be clear, we're starting from an investment side, and now looking deeper and deeper also in the financing area, and a lot of things have to be done in the upcoming years, and we as PwC try to shed light in this story, and also to disclose and prove the right data and metrics that are impactful, aligned with the aspects of UNEP-FI.
A question for you and Simone, I guess, that just popped in 21 minutes ago. Is it, should not there be an auditing aspect here to ensure accountability, since it's very easy to banks to say they align with the principles? Who wants to start, the auditor or the convener?
There actually is an assurance requirement. Well, we're going now into the details of how the principles for responsible banking work. But yes, there is a requirement to get some key reporting aspects assured, which is a complex and involved process, but it is there, yes.
You're working on that, Antonius?
Also, what we generally see in the market is, of course, kind of audit or assurance aspects are of importance, and also for PwC, we have kind of limited assurance for some clients that we already provide, bigger institution and so on. And but nevertheless, it's also a topic from the regulator side that should be expected, as we know in the European Union regarding to the upcoming regulation on CSRD, there are audit obligations that we see. Then there are international standards as ISSB and so on, IFRS reporting aspects that are coming to the agenda. In the United States, we have the difference between Europe and Switzerland, because Europe and Switzerland looks holistically on ESG, whereas the US is only focused on climate. But here also such aspects coming to the agenda, and will be important also to have clarity, transparency, credibility, and that we as a Big Four company provide to help our clients with this kind of assurance.
I will just say, though, that I think transparency is important, and it helps with accountability, but it only works, and that's why I'm actually very happy we have Reclaim Finance with us, if there are organizations, be it journalists and media, be it civil society, that then use this transparency to have a very critical look at what's actually happening and to challenge banks. When the assurance is there, it can state that the information provided is correct, but that there is a lot more depth and nuance to how well a bank is really doing. And so very happy that civil society is certainly on the case and challenging banks and being very critical, that media is there. And at the end of the day, that's what we can do. We can set frameworks, and we can have transparency. And of course, banks that are really not very clearly working to be in line with the frameworks, yes, we can deal with. But then all the nuances, that is really where the transparency then needs other actors to challenge banks, to hold to account, and to help improve. And one thing I will say, the Principles for Responsible Banking are the only finance initiative or the only framework that has a very formal way of engaging with civil society. They've been involved in developing the principles, but also they're part of the governance. We have a civil society advisory body. It's very interesting now to look back with the banks. When this was first proposed, there was a lot of skepticism, and we did it. And so far, the experience is very, very good. Of course, there is challenge, and that needs to be there. That's the role of the body. But there is also a lot of constructive dialogues and a lot of knowledge and expertise and help from civil society. It's really, once again, we need to move together and we need to work together also to ensure the accountability that the question targets here. Yeah.
Many questions coming in, even very practical questions. There's one for you, Lucie. It says to Lucie. So, where can I find all the numbers that you cited in your speech? Is there a public study you could share? That's from Marion Eringhaus. Please tell us that your data is available somewhere, Lucie.
So many data are already available on the website callexit.org, where you will find out how the Swiss banks are still or not supporting companies active in the coal sector, including those who are expanding. You might also find a lot of numbers on the website bankingonclimatecause.org, which again is a website associated to a report published by several organizations, including Reclaim Finance. And stay tuned for the publication just ahead of COP27 of a new report that will take a look at to what extent joining defense changed the way the members, banks, but also insurers, asset owners, and asset managers support companies with massive expansion plan. So that will be published just before COP. And unfortunately, what we see is that some of the banks do so, but are very far away from acting and changing the way they do business.
Thank you, Lucie, very much. A banker's question now for the banker of all bankers. Net zero emissions, I mean, to 2050 net zero emissions, as Christoph Kestenholz targets, are beyond strategic planning of banks. How can we make sure that short-term targets meaningful for strategy are set?
Well, if you join one of the alliances, targets are clearly set out. You need to prove and you need to show your path towards net zero. So from that point of view, and that's the reason why those milestones have been set. So you will be made accountable for what you do in the immediate future, not with regard to the long-term goal of 2050. So from that point of view, I think as long as you join these alliances or as long as you stick to the methodologies that have been developed and described by Simon, those short-term goals are clearly defined and need to be followed up, because finally you are accountable for what you do.
Since you have the microphone, another question for you. Switzerland seems to be quite behind other nations on regulations and focus on climate. That's a question, huh? What concrete actions can be taken to progress this?
Well, if we talk about regulation that is carried out by the lawmakers, yes, indeed, we are behind, but that was a deliberate choice. We strongly believe that following the path of regulation takes a lot of time. And you establish a framework that is not very flexible with regard to, or in view of the fact that everything is very much on the move. Methodologies are not clear. There are many standards, no internationally accepted, or it's coming to be now an internationally accepted standard, but it's still under development. So that's why we decided to have a self-regulatory framework put in place in Switzerland, to which all the Swiss banks have committed themselves. And the self-regulatory framework is much more flexible, much faster with regard to implementation, and hence the impact is bigger. And that's the reason why, for the time being, the strict regulatory framework put in place by the lawmaker has not happened yet. But of course, we need to prove that we are on the good path. If the banks do not deliver, then of course the regulatory framework will be tightened. But for the time being, we still are about to try to reach these goals by our own efforts.
And to add here, as Jörg mentioned, it's important to join these alliances because these are more effective at the end of the day, and also to reach the goals that we would like to have.
Absolutely, GFENS is a gold standard, as I mentioned it, and as long as you stick to these gold standards like GFENS or TCFD, you mentioned TCFD, you're obliged to follow that path, yep. That downward path. So the question indeed is, in how far can a regulatory framework improve or fasten the process? And if this can happen, then of course, why not? But for the time being, we really try to stick to international efforts and to international standards and methodologies.
Mr. Kumbarakis, Gloria Gelmini is asking you, I guess, if you see any trade-off between the fiduciary duty of big asset managers, because we haven't talked about asset management, but it's also very important in the GFANZ area. So is there a trade-off between this duty and the net zero commitment? It's true, might be a problem.
I would phrase it a little bit different. Is for the asset management industry is when they're setting up new products, for example, with a focus of net zero, that they have to clearly provide KPIs, metrics, concrete, that shows that. And I'm not saying, yeah, this is a product that has the intention for a sustainable objective when we focus on climate change mitigation or climate change adaptation or concrete, have a clean tech product in place. And the other is how to create impact. There is also, of course, due to engagement. But there are several strategies and aspects, not to go into the detail. And it is to such extent an obligation for the asset management industry, you know, to help. And these are the bigger ones to move in this direction. But there are also a lot of challenges, and to link here the discussion to net zero and science-based target at the end is these initiatives provide clear KPIs that can also be used at the end and incorporate that.
Thank you. Anonymous question for you, Simon Detling. Net zero is one objective among many other objectives that humanity has decided to set itself. Can net zero initiatives be linked to human rights standards and accountability to guarantee that this vital transition is not made at the expense of people?
That's absolutely essential to do.
It seems to be essential.
And I think I alluded to it a little bit, and this is why we also push banks to not just hone in on the net zero by 2050, but to join the principles for responsible banking. And I think we will see more and more, and we are working on that, a narrative evolving that brings these different aspects together, because indeed, we're not going to achieve a sustainable, livable future. We're not going to achieve climate targets without the well-being of our ecosystems, but also we need to move towards achieving these targets in a way that still ensures also social cohesion, that doesn't leave groups behind, not at the expense of, the future generations. But yes, these things need to come together. They're partly also context specific. And so, yes, absolutely. And I think we will see the narratives emerging more strongly. And from our side, under the principles for responsible banking, we are at the moment also working on guidance for what the interlinkages are. Intersectionality is a new word around it, and how banks can move in a way and set targets in a way that bring these issues forward together. So yeah, absolutely essential. We have a tendency to try to hone in on something very specific because it seems less complex. But we do need to embrace the complexity of these issues and find ways to deal with it. And once again, under the principles for responsible banking, you will see the guidance on impact analysis across the whole portfolio and understanding how different parts of your loan book are related to different impacts, how those are interrelated. It gives banks a very good view on how what they're financing impacts people, impacts our natural environment, and where they can make most difference, but also how setting a target in one direction needs action in different areas as well. So yeah, fully agree. It's not as easy to communicate sometimes as the net zero by 2050. It's one metric, one thing, but is indispensable. Yeah.
I think we still have a few minutes. Stop me whenever you want to stop me, but please don't do it right now. Question for you, Lucie Pinson. Someone is saying it's great that banks are aligning with targets in the future. What about transparency regarding current negative impacts and activities that need to stop?
Yeah, obviously, like transparency is a big issue, and we as NGO have only access to a partial amount of data regarding the financing that is still providing by banks to the economy in general, but including to the expansion of fossil fuels. So our data are actually below what the reality is. But I would like to comment on what has been said before about self-regulation and the need to or not to have enforcement mechanism being put in place in Switzerland as at international level. Frankly, self-regulation has led us in the situation we are now today. And it would be very naive to believe that it's gonna be the solution in a context of a climate emergency where the latest IPCC report told us very clearly that our emissions needs to peak in the coming 3 years. We really need regulation, and we cannot bait any longer on the only goodwill of the financial institutions. That's also the case for disclosure. Yes, the TCFD is a good step forward, but transparency and disclosure won't bring us where we need to be. To take one example, the insurance sectors has been warning about the risk related to climate change since 1972. We are 50 years later, and the insurance industry, even if they are leading the change and battle against fossil fuel expansion, most of the players are still ensuring making possible the development of new fossil fuel assets that don't fit into the remaining carbon budget. So clearly, betting on the goodwill of financial institutions won't make it, and we need sanction mechanism, and we cannot afford the luxury to wait to see that goodwill has failed. To think about what kind of sanction mechanism will be put in place. Fortunately, we might expect the Race to Zero initiatives to come win one and to take measures against defense members that would have not published by June 23 a transition plan where they will have integrated how they are going to support the phase out of fossil fuels and the end of the expansion of coal, oil, and gas. And here I would like to pick up what Simone was saying. Yes, a dialogue exists between the Alliance and civil society, but clearly we would like to see more of it, and we would like to have automatic consultation of civil society in the review of the requirements that are adopted by each alliance towards the members. And as I said, the NetZBA is planning a 3 years review, while other alliance like the NetZAOA is doing a annual review. Again, we won't get it right at the first shot. So we need annual reviews. That's really important. And the Alliance needs to associate civil society to this process to get feedback. And going back to one comment that was said about the US banks and Canadian banks maybe threatening to leave the Alliance. Sure, we will need them to fully decarbonize the economy because they are massive players. But an alliance who is slowing down actions for the sake of keeping members under the tent will be worthless. So if the US banks prefer to leave in response to strong requirements that are needed to meet the 1.5 pledge, it might actually be a good thing to make a divide between those who talk and those who act. Greenwashing from some defense members are not a good thing for the ones that are actually doing what they pledge to do.
I'm allowed to ask you one more question. I'm going to live dangerously and disobey and ask two, so you need to give me short answers to these two questions. Antonio, sorry guys. Antonio, this one is for you. It appears that 60% of Swiss banks have committed to net zero. However, not all assets are actually covered by the net zero alliances. How do you deal with that?
It's, as I said, but this is also the aspects that first of all the institution have to join, then they have to evaluate regarding to their asset class, and then also select the right methodology, and then starting decarbonize. And here it's important to do the next step, and based on that it's not only the investment side but also the financing side that should be of importance, and it's not so easy in practice to do that. And you're all at the starting point, and the next year will be challenging, but also very interesting.
And that's why we're all here. Very last question for you, very short answer, Jörg Gasser. Does Switzerland really have time to be a laggard? Should they not be showing leadership?
Should we not be showing what?
Leadership. Do we have time to do we still have time? Or Switzerland, or aren't we too slow? Shouldn't we show some leadership?
I'm not sure. Well, we are slow, but we're certainly not the slowest. And the question is always, do we want to be leader or do we want to be fast follower? For the time being, I'm not quite sure where we stand. We need to be a leader because our financial center is one of the biggest in the world. Of course, we have impact. The Swiss financial center is, as I said, is huge, and there is a leverage with regard to international assets or international money that has been that's been managed by Swiss banks. So from that point of view, we need to be a leader. But the question is, how fast can you be with regards to the goals to achieve? And if I just would like to come back to what Lucy said, I think this is very important. It is a very important point with regard to stopping and getting out. If you stop and you get out, then of course you do not reduce 1 gram, you do not take out 1 gram of CO2 out of the atmosphere. It's just, it will continue. So from that point of view, transition plans are extremely important, and they must be transparent. And these transition plans, they set the path, the pace with regard to the speed that we can achieve. And from that point of view, I think we are on a good track, and we are on the forefront.
Thank you very much, Jörg Gasser, Simon Dettling, Antonio Skombarakis. Thank you so much. You can either stay here or join your seat for the conclusive words. Your interest in the room and online has shown that if it was needed, that these initiatives definitely became more than words. Thank you, Simon Dettling. I'm sure our last speaker will agree in his conclusive address. We owe him the very happening of this event, senior managing partner of Mirabeau, 6th generation of bankers, I guess, and chairman of the board of the Geneva Financial Sector Foundation, Mr. Yves Mirabeau. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Alexis. Thank you to the panelists for this very interesting discussion. Dear guests, ladies and gentlemen, it is my pleasure and honor to have the last word this morning on this event organized jointly by the Swiss Banker Association and the Geneva Financial Center. This collaboration between our two organizations is not new and is particularly of great importance when it comes to sustainable finance. The Swiss Financial Centers plays a key role in facilitating the implementation of the United Nations 2030 Agenda, Sustainable Development Goals, and the Paris Climate Agreement. With 8.83 billion in assets under management at the end of 2021, Switzerland ranks among the top financial centers in the world. These private, corporate, and pension funds assets give the Swiss financial industry significant leverage to make sustainable investing the industry norm. It is therefore obvious that our two institutions actively collaborate in favor of a more sustainable economy. Both of us have been working closely to capitalize on synergies. This has been achieved by the setting up of the Romandie branch of Swiss banking at the Geneva Financial Center's headquarters to focus mainly on sustainable finance. The two-day events is a further step in the same direction. It is also no coincidence that we are meeting today in Geneva. Geneva occupies a unique position in the sustainable finance world thanks to its dynamic ecosystem comprised of financial institutions, asset managers, international organizations, NGOs, private foundations, and world-class universities. With strong support from the city, the canton, and the federal government, this diverse community is working together to create a virtuous cycle and accelerate the transition to a sustainable economy. I would like to thank our speakers for sharing their experience and exceptional expertise. I would also like to thank all of you for your active participation on site as well as online. Our today fruitful discussions and debates show how this subject is of a highly topical issue. They also highlight the challenges ahead, the data quality, the education of employees, information given to clients, and also the necessity of close relationships with the economy more broadly and the civil society. To address this, the following priorities have been defined by the Swiss Financial Center. First priority, self-regulation is key. In Switzerland, regulation in the field of sustainable finance follows a principle-based model calling for close cooperation among all relevant stakeholders. Comparing to the EU mindset, Swiss regulation is therefore based on voluntary action and driven by a bottom-up process. At the end, this leads to an industry-driven, internationally compatible approach, which I'm convinced is the best solution to bring together every stakeholder. In this regard, I would like to mention the 3 recent self-regulations developed by the Swiss Bankers Association for the banking industry and by the Asset Management Association Switzerland for the asset managers. The first 2 ones address on one side the integration of ESG preferences and ESG risks into investment advice and portfolio management for the banking industry, and on the other side, the mortgage providers on the promotion of energy efficiency. The third one concerns the product side with standards for asset managers. Second priority, education. In order to accelerate the banking sector transition to sustainability, finance and sustainability must be integrated into professional, continuing, and academic education. This is sine qua non if the Swiss Financial Center is to remain equal to the expectations of its clients. This is the only way to offer attractive products and services that meet sustainable criteria. Third priority, digitalization and data reliability. Developing comparable and easily usable data sets and usable data sets and KPIs is a key issue should the Swiss Financial Center continues to play a pivotal role in the economy's transition. If banks admit that they need to inform their clients about the sustainability of their investments, they need company data to do so. This is because financial flows reflects the activities of the real economy. Currently, sustainability data on Swiss companies are not always available. In this regard, I would like to point out the Swiss climate scores elaborated by the federal government in association with the financial industries and NGOs. The Swiss climate scores offer greater transparency regarding the Paris alignment of financial investments. This leads to the fourth priority, transparency. The Swiss climate scores are a pioneering move on the part of the Swiss Financial Center, positioning it as a go-to source of data for customers and investors, both in Switzerland and abroad. The transparency in the information given to the clients aims at avoiding any mismatch between investors' expectation and the characteristics of sustainable products offered by financial institutions. Let's face it, there is still a long way to go. To speed up the journey, I would like to call on all of our members to sign and commit to the net zero initiatives, as well as to start right now to required systemic and strategic changes. Only by working together will we be able to pave the way to a sustainable economy and society. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Yves, and thanks to all our speakers today. Thank you to Swiss Banking and GFPF and all the staff members who made that event possible. Thank you online, thank you on site. As you know, building bridges keeps on going everywhere. And don't forget 2 particular events. Do I have the names? No, I do have it here. Disclosing Climate is the first one, from international sustainability to the Swiss Climate Scores, that is held today by the Asset Management Association of Switzerland. And another one tomorrow, implementing sustainability in wealth management by the private bankers. That is, again, tomorrow. So thank you all for coming, and I guess I'll see you around. Bye-bye. Thank you very much.